Last, but again, definitely not least, Sabeel Rahman. I got to know Sabeel through the Gettysburg Project, which is actually a really important effort to bring greater degree of participation into the grassroots organizations that serve working people in America. But he's also a political theorist with a recent degree in political theory, or political science or political theory, whatever. And studying what we I think a lot of us are worried we are entering a new Gilded Age of economic inequality and upheaval. He's on his way to be a professor at the Brooklyn Law School starting in 2015, and right now is a For Freedom Center Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Sabeel.
So let me do this. Thanks, Peter, and all the Tisch folks for organizing this. Yeah, I don't have a PowerPoint, but we can keep Josh's awesome pictures in mind. So, I think we're all here because we have some common intuitions, right? We all want to make democracy work better, and we all have some intuition that doing that is a necessary precursor to solving kind of very real social, ecological, economic challenges that we face. So kind of looking at this moment that we're in a broader sort of historical and theoretical perspective, I want to lay out a couple of ideas to inform our discussion for the next couple of days. So the first is that when we talk about democracy, for it to work, it has to be deeply embedded in the daily practice of governing. It can't be layered on top. The second is that democracy, I think, actually has a substantive vision to it. It's not a neutral concept. The equality that we aspire to in a democracy is the same kind of equality that shapes a particular view about what a just economy looks like, what a just society looks like. And the third, which picks up great off of the last two presenters, is that for democracy to work, it has to be, it's not about just building consensus, it's actually about making conflict productive. So to put some kind of context for that, or some deepen that a little bit, I want us to think back to 100 years ago. So it's 2014. 100 years ago, give or take, perhaps depressingly, we in the U.S. face a lot of the same problems that we face now. So this is the era of J.P. Morgan, the man, not the company, but we were just as afraid of him then as we are now. It's the era, we call it too big to fail now, but it was what Louis Brandeis called the curse of bigness. It was a problem not just of big finance, but big corporations in general, and this frightening notion that these quasi-sovereign, semi-sovereign entities could exercise so much power over the day-to-day lives of workers and citizens who had no channel through which to shape the exercise of that power. So that was the first concern for reformers during in the aftermath of the first Gilded Age, a populist and progressive era, sort of turn of the 20th century. The second problem was one of market insecurity. So whether it's financial crises or the upheavals of the labor market, there's a growing sense among reformers during that time start to put words on paper that market forces were not natural. They were actually the product of politics. They are the product of lots of really small instances of coercion and unequal bargaining power. So between the disparities between employers and workers, the disparities between strong corporations like Standard Oil and captured government regulators, which all, when you add it all up, produces this thing that is the market that seems to shape so much of our daily life, but has to clearly be the subject of reform. And the third concern was familiar to all of us today, a problem of political unresponsiveness. So a hostile Supreme Court that struck down a lot of early efforts at social and economic reform, machine party politics where the problem wasn't so much a lack of bipartisanship, which is the kind of lingo today, but really just a problem of unequal representation, that people in the room were not reflective of their constituencies. So you add all of that up, and there was an extraordinarily rich period of innovation, of ferment, of ideas. And what I take away from that period is that for us, democracy is really about building capacity, and it's building the capacity to contest exercises of power. I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind, because it's not just about making government more efficient, more legitimate, or even creating consensus for the sake of consensus, but it's about empowering people to achieve a particular vision of economic justice, a vision that is counter to the concentrations of private power, counter to these kinds of market insecurities that undermine individual and collective well-being, and counter to the sort of indignity of not having a voice in shaping our own future. So, you know, what does that mean for us? I think two conceptual distinctions, and then I want to kind of give some examples. So the first is, I think we have to distinguish between the micro practices of democracy and the macro structures of democracy. So micro practices, I think of as collective problem solving. This is the kind of stuff that you know, Josh was talking about just a minute ago. When you have people in the room, you need to find ways to make the disagreements productive and to drive it to a kind of collective problem solving. And that's what a lot of us in the room work on, and that's great. But that's different from macro structures. The macro structures of democracy, I think, are much less about creating consensus or problem solving, and much more about finding ways to balance the terms of political power. So we live in an unequal society. Many of us who are affected by various policies or social conditions do not have ways of making ourselves heard, and that's a matter of real conflict. And macro democratic institutions, I think, need to take that head on. The second distinction I want to make is between values and policies. So values, I think, are actually fixed. They're our North Star, things like justice, equality, and freedom. What we take these values to mean are actually not up for debate, really. They're up for persuasion. We want to convince people that freedom really isn't just the freedom to be fired and work and have to find work in order to get health care, right? That's a commitment. It's not actually up for compromise, I don't think. It's up for persuasion. It's a matter of persuasion. So values, I think, are different from policies. Policies are where we want to be flexible. Policies are where we want to be collaborative, because how we realize the values are necessarily going to have to be informed by what's possible, by facts on the ground, by competing considerations from other voices. So with those distinctions in mind, I think it points us towards thinking about the structure of our democracy in some different ways. And so I want to give a couple of examples from my own academic work, which is mainly in the field of economic regulation. And so, you know, regulation, if you think about it, is sort of like your archetypical anti-democratic space, right? It's experts, it's technocratic. You know, no one really knows what goes on in the Fed, right? So, but, you know, I think it's an interesting space to think about making some of these ideas of democracy real, because it's where a lot of the day-to-day governance actually happens. So I'll give two examples just to throw out a couple minutes left. So one is one route to democracy of the kind that I'm pointing towards in the regulatory state is through participatory monitoring. And so an example in the economic realm is from the Community Reinvestment Act. So a lot of you probably are familiar with it. The Community Reinvestment Act was a policy that tried to prevent redlining, the practice of directing mortgage lending and kind of credit in general away from minority communities. But what I'm especially interested from the democracy perspective is that the CRA had this really small provision, which was pretty minor in its early going, which was that it created a channel for community-based organizations to trigger inspections of banks that they thought were not meeting the standard. And what's interesting about this is that, first of all, the standard was written pretty broadly, so it was open to interpretation and debate. Second of all, there was this hook that community groups could request agencies to inspect banks in their area. And third of all, there were real stakes, because if banks didn't pass the inspection, they wouldn't get approved for mergers down the line, and that really hurt during this period of intense financial consolidation in the 80s, or in the 70s and 80s. So when you add that up, what you got was, in cities where you had robust civil society organizations, it actually created a virtuous cycle where, by having a way to make themselves heard and to actually sort of have real teeth to what they were saying, community groups are able to exert leverage against both banks and regulators who were not enforcing the regulations. this is not a story of consensus. It's a story, I think, of productive conflict. So a second example I'll give is thinking about the issue of representation in the regulatory state. So, we just had this debate about, the Volcker rule, where this group, Occupy the SEC, kind of brought together a bunch of experts and community groups to give their sort of 300-page version of what the Volcker rule ought to be from the standpoint of folks on the ground. And, this is fine and good, but it's a far cry from actually having a seat at the table. And so one way to think about what we could have done with Dodd-Frank, which we didn't really get, is, what if we actually had representatives from different constituencies that are affected by too big to fail, workers, homeowners, and so on, as seats on the Financial Stability Oversight Council. It's not how the council's set up, but it would be a way of instilling this kind of productive conflict that I have in mind. I'm running short on time, so I just want to close with a kind of zoom out a little bit. And if we take this idea of democracy as being systemically embedded in our political institutions, as being around substantive values and as being oriented towards productive conflict, I think it tells us something about what we're trying to do, to Peter's question from the beginning. I think it means that democracy as a whole is about building capacity, the capacity to engage in politics, to make decisions. And it means that for associations, the goal of associations are to mobilize and organize, to enable individuals who alone can't exercise voice to collectively exercise voice. And then for institutional design, I think it means that the goal is to create two things. The first is spaces for collective problem solving. So the fact that people in the room in Rosario were actually making the land use plan, that's an institutional decision that predates that setting, right? And second, to create the kind of procedures for productive conflict to hold people accountable when those plans are not actually broadly legitimate in serving the set of interests that are affected. So looking forward to the rest of our discussion. I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Lot to think about, and I don't think, 5 people who said the same thing. I think 5 people who said actually quite interestingly different things, and it's worth pulling that apart. I don't know if it's productive conflict, but there were different perspectives there. So the way we work is to talk at tables about what you heard. I would say when people were coming in, they were sitting with people they knew already, which is perfectly natural and fine, and I would do it too. But it's not really going to work since your main instruction is to get to know the other people at your table and then talk about what you heard. It won't work if you already know all the people at your own table. So it would be great if people probably need to stand up and stretch a little anyway after this talk. So why doesn't everybody get up in order to empty all those seats and then move around a little bit?